Okay, so good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. And it is my pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Dr. Eunsil O. I know it's at 9 p.m. At Wisconsin. So thank you for accommodating us and for spending the evening here. I really appreciate that. Now, let me say a few words by way of introduction. Dr. O is an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research investigates both the cultural as well as structural foundations of work and family decision-making processes. Specifically, she's working on how women define social mobility, including explanations behind declining fertility. She also studies how overwork shapes work and fertility decisions in the context of South Korea. Her work has been published in Journal and Society, in Gender and Society, as well as not least AJS, which is American Journal of Sociology, both of course very excellent journals. So Dr. O will speak for about 40 minutes, followed by there are about 20 minutes of Q&A. So I ask you to reserve your questions till then, and then to unmute yourselves and to pose your question when the time comes. All right, sounds good? Okay, over to you, Eunsil.
Thank you so much. I am very happy to be here, and I'll probably put, let me see. I'll start sharing. Should I just go straight in?
Yep, yep.
All right, okay. Let's see. Share screen. Right, I'll be sharing my screen. Projection mode. All right. So this is my presentation. Hello all. Probably good morning in Singapore. It's pretty late today, right now in Madison. It's around 9 p.m. But I'm really glad to have this opportunity to share one of my works that's in progress. It's almost it's at the final stage of revisions, but preparing a presentation was a very different task than revising a manuscript. So I did have to cut a lot of theories. So hopefully that we can have more time for discussion and comments and Q&A. So I look really forward to, as I'm finalizing this manuscript, I look forward to some comments or Q&As or any kind of feedback that you have related to this project. Today's talk will be on gender, educational expansion, and polarization of aspirations. Okay? And I'm going to use South Korea as an illustrative case. Okay? Today's talk, in terms of flow, is as follows. I'll start with my research question. It will be one brief slide. I'll move on to theoretical framework that I'm using for this particular project. And then I'm going to introduce the case and the contextual framework that I'm going to be using by exploring the case of South Korea. And then I'm going to move on to talk about data and my analytic strategy, which including my sample. And then I'm going to share three main findings that I have related to this topic. Lastly, I did bring brief short summary of implications of the findings. So my research question for this particular project is as follows. I ask whether, if so, how women in contemporary South Korea, hereafter Korea, arrive at different aspirations, including career aspirations, family aspirations, and status aspirations. So basically, we exploring within women, how should we understand differences and commonalities that emerge amongst women in terms of how they construct, how they arrive at their aspirations. And here, aspirations would include both family and a career. So it's not going to only be on career. I am going to emphasize a lot about work aspirations, but towards the end, I will have some time to discuss what other aspirations that women have that is strongly related to career aspirations, which is family aspirations. And I'm going to try to connect with how career, and family aspirations relate to status aspirations as well. All right, so the theoretical framework that I'll be using for this particular study relates to the, theories around aspirations. So there were a lot of literature on aspirations, more than I already knew. So it was a very interesting process of exploring what we know already about aspirations theoretically and empirically, and how I can use this framework in my study. So I'm going to first start talking about existing frameworks for aspirations. So there are different approaches to understand aspirations. So starting with the early Wisconsin model, which looks at aspirations as simply a mechanism that explains causal mechanisms explain the status attainment. For instance, you aspire to have higher education and you attain it. So very simply, you aspire something and you are likely to attain that goal because you aspired for it. And then the allocation model came out, kind of criticizing the Wisconsin model of aspiration by saying how resources, including constraints and opportunities, actually shape what's attained or what's achieved rather than aspirations. So it's more about structural constraints and opportunities that really determine what is attained or achieved rather than aspirations. So a lot of kind of what we know as of now is kind of embedded in this model. And then there was an emergence of this cultural model, mainly by cultural sociologists like Michel Lamont or other macro-level cultural sociologists that explain how aspirations has its own value. It's more about morality and how you value yourself. It's more about worth, and it's actually a shared value. So it's not always related to what you can achieve or what you're likely to achieve. It's more about your aspiring. For instance, working class individuals can aspire to receive higher education, regardless of how realistic that aspiration is or what kind of constraints that they get. It's kind of shared value that you aspire to have higher education or upward mobility. And then the rational choice model, after all this Wisconsin allocation and culture model emerged from sociology in the 60s and 70s and 80s, kind of sociologists stopped talking about aspirations or focusing on aspirations that much. Then we had rational, and then economists kind of took over and they started talking about aspirations within their own conceptual toolkits, mainly with the famous rational choice model. Interestingly, the rational choice model scholars have devoted a lot of attention to the subject of aspirations and anticipations of the future. In particular, the fundamental premise of this literature is that you actually calculate the future, maximizing future benefits into your calculation. Therefore, your aspiration reflects not only current moment, but also your future anticipated gains by aspiring something. For instance, higher education. If you're aspiring to receive higher education, you're also thinking about getting a job and a certain type of job. And then you're trying to maximize your future gains by aspiring a certain route. So, as we kind of expected, the rational choice theorists started talking about this future and anticipation when they were trying to understand aspirations and constructions of aspirations. And then we have pragmatic, metistic, and agentic approach that looks at aspirations as a strategy. And one of the human agencies actually is reflected on how you can predict your future and how much control you have towards the future outcomes. And it's actually your current strategy, but that reflects past and current constraints and opportunities. But not only that, but your future anticipated gains. So it's more of a kind of holistic viewpoint approach to understanding aspirations and really rooting this analysis based on really agentic approach where you kind of want to have more control over your future and you're anticipating your future, and therefore you're constructing aspirations based on your anticipation. And having control is one of the main feature of this approach, pragmatic approach. Lastly, cultural and cognitive approach emphasizes that there is not only, so it's more of an interactive approach between structural constraints and opportunities and individual level kind of desires. So last cultural and cognitive approach kind of really wraps all the things that we learned about aspirations. Therefore, cultural and cognitive approach on aspirations emphasize how individuals make their aspirations, construct their aspirations based on not only structural and cultural constraints and opportunities, but their own desires as an individual. So there is kind of really interactional aspect of macro structural conditions as well as micro desire and aspirations that may come from families or your friendship or relationship. But there is kind of interwoven relationship between macro context and individual level desire. And we have to look at both levels in order to understand aspirations. And my theoretical framework is kind of in line with the last kind of most updated conversion approach of aspirations, where we have to, I urge that we have to, at least my case study, we have to look at both structural and cultural macro level conditions, but also individual level motivations, individual level aspirations for certain values. In particular, and then here's kind of summary, women's aspirations for the family and career, which is the case study that I'm introducing here, reflects both structural and ideological context at the macro level. So your aspirations is likely to reflect what you've experienced from the past, what the current context is in which you make decisions and construct aspirations, whether you have a lot of opportunities or constraints, really will be reflected in your aspirations. However, it also reflects, aspirations are also reflecting future trajectory too. Therefore, what's underexplored in the literature of aspirations, as well as this women's aspirations in the context of South Korea, is how women's aspirations reflect not only past and present, but future trajectory or aspire trajectory for the future. In particular, I point to two important aspects of looking at individual level cognitive level aspirations or construction of aspiration. That's at the intersection of structural constraints, structural opportunities, but not only that, but also your individual desire, is that one, there's a very underexplored area on aspirations related to status mobility. So you aspire and you're aspiring for the future, and the role of status mobility or seeking higher status hasn't really been incorporated into the study of aspirations. So I want to use that as one of my theoretical frameworks. The other issue is, and this relates to how I kind of frame the aspiration or the whole talk, not only just focusing career aspirations, but also family aspirations, which is for women, when you talk about aspirations, it is really hard, and mainly in a context where there is high gender inequality level, it is really hard to just talk about career aspirations without talking about family aspirations. There is a very strong interactive relationship between work and family aspirations for women that has to be addressed in understanding aspirations. So for instance, projections and outcomes of family formation has a high impact on aspirations, and particularly career aspirations for women. For instance, if I aspire to commit more to career, I may have to negotiate my aspirations for family formation or my desire for family formation. If I aspire to have many children in the future, and that's what my goal and that's my desire and aspiration, I may have to reconstruct my career aspirations within a society where there is a high gender inequality in terms of labor market conditions for mothers. The contextual framework that I'm using to study aspirations and the construction of aspirations of women is contemporary South Korea. And it is it was a very interesting and fun task to contextualize the whole setting of South Korea and contemporary South Korea, and in particular women living in contemporary South Korea, because this context, I think it will reflect a lot of Asian context. So, and I learn a lot from, and I build upon a lot of scholars who study Asia as their case, and who really theorize cases from Asia. Korea, as you all know, went through massive and rapid social change, similarly to many of Asian contexts. This is Seoul in 1960s, 70s, particularly 70s. This is kind of, as you can see, the photo is horrible. It's actually looking at the river that runs through Seoul metropolitan area. It's called Han River. And this is what it looks like in 2010. So there's a massive, it can just really geographically, urbanizations happen, industrialization happen, post-industrialization, massive, not just in size, but also rapid in speed, social change happen in South Korea. And in contextualizing particularly work family aspirations of women in South Korea, we need to understand three different patterns that are related to massive social change. First one is educational expansion for men and women, particularly for women because it was relatively more massive, but the education expansion happened for both men and women in South Korea. And second, we have to learn how to, the context in which that shows education and employment paradox for women, meaning there has been a massive expansion for educational attainment level, but not as massive expansion for employment level of women. So scholars have been calling this education and employment paradox for women. And Korea demonstrates a very representative case of this paradox. Lastly, this is part of the context, but also related to the outcomes of what I'm finding and what outcomes of education and employment changes and patterns. But this is at the same time context in which I explore the topic for my talk. So I'm introducing the third one, which is changes in aspiration and decisions related to family formation, mainly demographic shifts. So education expansion, education employment paradox, and demographic shifts are three important contextual aspects that we have to keep in mind in understanding aspirations of women. So just looking at education expansion, you will notice these are all the countries from OECD, post-industrialized, relatively rich countries. And as you can see, Korea is all the way on the left, that has the highest percentage of education, or people with tertiary degree, which is above high school degree, including 2-year vocational, community college, as well as 4-year bachelor's degree and then graduate degree. If you just look at education expansion in South Korea from 1955 to 2012, for everyone, you will see the yellow bar has been increasing. So this is for everyone. So the younger generation, the more the newer or the younger generation, younger cohort group has much higher percentage of higher education. For instance, this is only for women and men in 25 to 35 age range. So only those who are in this age range. This is how this is a percentage of the population in that age range that had above secondary or tertiary education. So if you see in 1995, which is the first year point, reference point, the percentage of the whole population, within whole population, those who had tertiary education was around 28%. Whereas in 2021, I have a 20, this is 20, it only has up to 2017. The percentage goes up to 69. So that's massive, and the most massive education expansion in the world until today. So education expansion happened massively and rapidly in South Korea. That's the whole takeaway point with this figure. And if you look at 2011, which is the orange line, this is when around the time when there was a reversal of gender gap between men and women, meaning educational attainment level for women was actually became higher than men around late 2000s. So by 2011, the within population, women had more education than men, population level. And this trend continued. So nowadays, I believe women have around 76% for those who are in 25 to 35 age range, and men, it was around 67. So the gap was actually, it became bigger and bigger. So if you just look at for women then, because of gender reverse happened in around 2009 or 2010, that meant women before the older generation, compared to men, they had less of education, but now women have more education. So women with college degree, the age range of 24, 25 to 35 in 1980 was 8%, whereas in 2014, it was 70%. So that's massive within women. Generationally, transgenerationally, there is a massive generational gap. So my mother is in that group, 8%, whereas I'm in the 70% group. So she's high school graduate where I have PhD. So she never went around the college where I was just in college for a lot of my life. I actually represent not the majority, but not the outlying case in the context of South Korea. So I'm a pretty representative case of upward mobility in terms of educational attainment level within women if you compare transgenerationally. However, compared to this massive educational attainment level and the opportunity structure opening up for women, employment patterns were not that massive or great, and as you probably all know. Going back to the same OECD data, right now, this is employment rates for 25 to 34-year-olds, same data sets, who has tertiary attainment education. Here, Korea is not the one on the left with the highest level. Korea is actually all the way towards the right, probably 7 from the right side. So relatively lower in terms of employment rates, mainly because women's employment rate. If you look at how motherhood or marriage or around the age of marriage and motherhood, how it impacts women's employment cycle compared to men within South Korea. And this reference year is 2014. You would note that there's still an M curve where a lot of women withdraw from the labor market, and including mostly non-employed, because this data includes those who have, so part-time jobs are also included as employment. I'm looking at 30 to 34, blue line for women, and that's 60%. So if there's and this is excluding part-time jobs. So 60% are non-employed. Some of them are part-time, some of them are full-time. That's 40%. 40% part-time and full-time, but 60% are not employed. And this level goes below 60% when the age range goes to 35 to 39. So still, a lot of scholars say that, it's great that a lot of highly educated women get a job, they get employed, but it is unlikely that women in South Korea, regardless of their educational attainment level, will experience continuous employment pathways throughout their life, especially compared to men. So still, a lot of women quit or withdraw from the labor market around the age of marriage and childbearing, is the message. And then interesting, puzzling aspects also arise too, because when you're thinking, wow, there's a huge education expansion, people are working. Women are probably working a lot, but not many were working. But then you're also thinking, well, maybe then if they're not working, maybe they get education and then they get married and maybe they have many children. Well, no. So there are very puzzling trend-related social trends that shows how low fertility has been issue for the context of South Korea. And this is a very important context as well. There has been a lot of changes in family formation. roughly in half a century. And as we know, this is happening in most of Asian contexts, particularly in East Asian contexts. There has been demographic trends that shifted at a high speed. Total fertility rate fell very quickly in South Korea, 6.1 in 1960 to 1.23 in 2010, and it's around 1 nowadays. Divorce rate increased, and the more women choose not to get married. So non-marriage rate has been increasing as well. So there has been very important contextual and outcome related patterns related to family formation in South Korea. So this is a total fertility rate that fell from 6.1 to 1.23, and now it's below 1.23, so it's even lower. And also a very interesting, important pattern emerges related to this kind of aspiration and family decision making, where South Korean women are rejecting to the idea of marriage, heterosexual sexuality, relationship, and rejecting fertility, and rejecting to dating. So there are 4 rejections, which is not getting married, not having babies, not dating, and not having heterosexual sexual relationship. So these are called 4B movements, and majority of the kind of drivers of these 4B movements are known to be women. How do we understand this theoretically? So there's a context in which there has been education expansion and lots of social change. We do need macro level theoretical framework to understand this context. And I'm kind of going to skip this because it's kind of written in thoroughly in my manuscript, but I think I want to have more time to share my findings. So in terms of South Korea as a context, I framed the context using existing theoretical frameworks that particularly looks at context in which there's massive transformations happening at the moment. And there are different frameworks, including unsettled times, transitional temporalities, and compressed modernity. And the reason why I really appreciate these frameworks is that they actually argue within this transformation time or transitional temporalities, we really have to understand ideological formation because they're at the center of guiding individuals' behavior. I'll probably skip that. And I also have a lot of theoretical toolkits that help us understand the aspirations within this kind of transitioning context, looking at the micro level aspect. So micro level theoretical frameworks include G's modern traditional mosaic, which I really like. But also I build up upon Nancy Abelman's approach as towards class when you are trying to understand individual level aspirations. Class mobility as a transgenerational project, which involves making and remaking of class and upward mobility, and how you have to understand aspirations within this context. So I use qualitative interviews to answer the question of how women construct and arrive at their aspirations related to work and family in particular, with the goal of identifying primary interpretation given by the participants and the rationale behind decision-making process. And I use, therefore, in-depth interviews to get at that goal. My in-depth interviews are from 2 urban settings, Seoul and Busan, which more than 50% of whole population resides. And their in-depth interviews, I added a little bit more as I was kind of finalizing my analysis. I decided to include unmarried interviewees, and I'll explain that a little bit more. So I have 126 in-depth interviews, and criteria for interviews included living in Seoul, urban areas. I also had Busan. The majority of my interviewees were from Seoul. They're native-born Korean, and they had at least 1 year of employment experience. I did not necessarily recruit individuals based on diverse based on these criteria, including education, schools, neighborhood, jobs and employment status, marital status, motherhood status, socioeconomic background, their own as well as their parents. So these are diversifying variables or backgrounds for my respondents. This is my recruiting strategy. I did get help from online survey to get at kind of more sample or diverse sample, as well as I use restricted snowball sample where I only get referrals up to 2 people. I had 40 open-ended questions, and they vary a lot, but they were including education-related questions, work experience, expectations, family experience, expectations, relationships, and I had a lot of questions, mainly ordered in the back of my questionnaires about their perceptions. And this is my sample characteristics. There are 126 of them, and the median age was 33, ranging from 27 to 42. 24% were married, but they didn't have children. Women did not have their children yet, or they were not planning to have one. Almost half were married with children. And then the rest of 1/4 of my sample were not married. Okay. Some of them were not planning to get married. Some of them were planning to get married, but just weren't married at the point of the interview. In terms of educational attainment level, 32% had high school or 2-year vocational, 30% had bachelor's degrees, and then 38% were elite educated. And I'll explain this a little bit. I have an extra slide of what kind of jobs that they had. But remember how almost 70 for this age range, almost 70% had above high school or tertiary education level. So therefore, I divided the highly educated group into 2 different groups. One just BA holders, and the other elite educated, including those who have bachelor's degree from top universities in South Korea, as well as universities outside of South Korea. So they're categorized under elite group, whereas BA holders who are not from the top universities in South Korea were categorized as BA holders. And the rest of them were high school graduates. I had few 2-year vocational college, but they had very similar occupational trajectory and income level. So I categorized them under with the high school degree women. So they differ by educational attainment level. I'd be happy to talk more about how I went through multiple rounds of interpretations and really interactive process of inductive insight and deductive analysis in the Q&A. But there was transcriptions involved, sorting and categorizing different themes, and then going back to the sorted and categorized data set to find, interpret and to find primary explanations that helps us understand how women construct their aspirations was my task. There are 3 findings that I want to share. But before sharing the 3 findings, I just want to give you a preview of the summary. Findings show that there are aspirations, but there are polarizations of aspirations, and that helps us to link between education and women's employment. So the purpose was to understand aspirations. Therefore, I'm going to invest a lot of time in talking about this ideological and cultural aspect of that links education and employment. Having said that, I'm not necessarily arguing that this is more important than structural constraints or opportunities. Of course, workplace constraints, opportunities, and discriminations are really important in terms of context. However, because the purpose was, and there are lots of rich study, strong line of work that investigates how structural labor market conditions and workplace cultures shape women's decisions about work. But this particular study aims to look at the cultural aspiration side. So I'm going to focus on that side for my findings. And at the center, there is a polarization of aspirations. And at the center of polarization of aspirations lies different stances on whether female education is a human capital to be invested for the family versus the labor market. The reproducers of gendered expectations define, mainly traditional gendered expectations, define female achievement as a resource to be invested in childbearing and managing the household. In contrast, the vanguards were those who want to shift this gendered ideas, redefine female achievement, and uses the logic of upward mobility and status seeking to over-triumph patriarchal gendered expectations. So this is my preview of the findings. I'll share three main findings that are basically talking about this summary. So first, there was an emergence of diverging career and family aspirations. I wasn't necessarily looking for two different pathways or three different or one commonality, but there was a very meaningful differentiations. Right? A lot of women talked about educational seeking and wanting to seek status by obtaining educational attainments and going to college or going to high school, good one, really seeking status by getting education first. So they think about how they study hard to go to the college or study hard to go to good high school. So it was kind of a common theme that they really aspire to attain educational attainment level. However, when I asked them about what were you thinking or what were you aspiring when you were pursuing higher education or pursuing education, majority of women said, well, that was kind of short-term goal, like, it was kind of stepping stone for future achievement or status. So it was really kind of the aspirations about career and family was very vague at the moment of attending high school or attending college for them. Different strategies and anticipations of seeking status emerge after they graduate from their high school or graduated from their college and obtain their jobs. And I call the two different diverging career, family, diverging aspirations, passengers versus drivers. So the passengers are actually referring to, in this particular case, passengers of status seeking. So you're on the passenger side of the status seeking unit. And thinking of a car as an analogy, you're thinking like this cool car, bigger car, or good brand car, BMW car, but you're sitting on the passenger side. You're chipping in, you're kind of supporting the driver, right? Versus you have this drivers of status seeking. You're the driver, like you have your own status and you want to seek status, you want to have upward mobility, but that's regardless of what your family is doing or your partner is doing, what your children are doing. You just really have your own status and you're seeking upward mobility. Those who construct status seeking as passengers tend to prioritize family aspirations. If you want to have 2 children, you're willing to sacrifice your career. If you want to get married to this person who wants you to quit working, you're willing to do that. You're prioritizing whatever needs or desires your family members have. Whereas the drivers of status seeking, you want more mobility, upward mobility, or you want to maintain your high status or experience upward mobility as drivers of status seeking, you tend to prioritize career aspirations. You want to keep your career and you also want to have promotion. You want to really have continuous career pathways and experience upward mobility in terms of income and wealth eventually. So there was 2 kind of different aspirations, trajectories that I found within my sample. And this is an exemplary case of passenger of status seeking. Soyoung 32 represents a case of passengers of status seeking, saying, I really value using your skills, talents, and matured mindsets to manage and nurture a family. I have lots of ability and want to use those abilities to take care of my husband, my children, and my parents and in-laws. So a lot of this educational attainment level or experience in the occupation are really resources to be poured into the family for the family's good and welfare of the family rather than your own aspirations in the labor market or public sphere. This is a kind of different case where it shows exemplary case of drivers of status seeking, which is the other part of aspirations, kind of aspirations. Chang'un 38 talks about this in this way. My achievements are important. I have a child, but whatever she achieves is not mine. I have a great, successful husband, but whatever he owns in terms of occupation, property, or money belong to him. They're not mine. I need to be independently pursuing my own career and my own. And Jane, who actually used this analogy, which I ended up picking up, of driving a car, talks about the drivers being drivers of status seeking in this way. I have some friends, not that close, who like to get married and to become rich by getting married. They look for guys who drive Benz or BMW. They relate what their boyfriends own as what they themselves own. I do not think that is important for me. I want to sit on the driver's side, not the passenger side. Benz is great, although I'm not a big fan of foreign cars, but what matters is whether that is yours or not. So she kind of talks about how she talks about being the driver, and she also brings this experience of interacting with her mom when watching K-drama and all these girls wanting to date a rich guy versus this independent girls, the figure. So she also talks about this polarization of aspiring to become the passenger or the driver, which really I ended up picking up because that really represented a lot of my most of my samples and interviewees eventually in understanding the aspirations and the polarizations of aspirations. The second finding is related to then what really helps us understand part of the source of that diverging aspirations. What might, I don't want to use the word what might impact or shape, but what is related as a perception, like how do they explain this? When I ask, where did you get those kind of ideas? Or, when I try to understand where does this polarization coming from? And this is my my analytic finding that the amount of accumulated achievements, especially education and occupation wise, and particularly upward mobility, the amount of upward mobility shapes prioritizing career aspirations over other desires. So your achieved, mainly perceived upward mobility really creates this reasoning, rationale behind whether you're going to have the passenger mindset versus driver of status seeking mindset. Okay. And this relates to prioritizing family aspirations and prioritizing career aspirations. Then I went back to the data set to see what is the upward mobility they're talking about. So a lot of my respondents talked about upward mobility in referencing their mothers, not necessarily their fathers. Most of them were referencing their mothers. So I checked the mother-daughter gap in educational attainment level. So on the left side, the rows are divided by mother's educational attainment level. I had three whose mothers were, whose respondents' mothers were elementary school graduates. So that was the highest education they met. Of course, because of this education expansion, we have a lot of upward mobility within this woman group, intergenerational, transgenerational group. So mother and daughter gap in educational attainment level shows a lot of women in my interviewees sample experience upward mobility in terms of educational attainment level. Some had same educational attainment level as their mothers. This is an exemplary case, and the reason why I bring this up is because the upward mobility, the amount of jump you achieved compared to your mother was really critical in shaping your aspirations, in particular for career aspirations. So for instance, we have two cases from same university. It's a very prestigious women's college like Wellesley. They both went to, so Mina and Sarang went to both went to same college, where Mina uses this driver narrative, whereas Sarang ended up using passenger narrative. She's more family oriented, whereas Mina is more career oriented. And Mina talks about how her mother, who's high school graduate, was so proud when she got to Ewha University, which was like almost impossible dream for her mother. Whereas Sarang, who went to the same college, was kind of expressing how her mom actually went to the same school, and how this wasn't a big deal in her family. She kind of almost felt like she was downward mobility. She experienced downward mobility compared to her mom. And this is very important in terms of how women explain their perceived aspirations. And in particular, their perceptions of upward mobility was really important to understand how they arrive at their career aspirations. So some of them actually jumped to, which is, so for instance, my mother is high school graduate, I have PhD. That's not one jump, that's two jumps in terms of actual mobility. In terms of perceived mobility, I interpret it as really a very massive high jump from my mother. So there is related difference between actual jump or upward mobility that you achieved compared to your own mother, and as well as the perceptions of upward mobility. But perceptions of upward mobility really shaped women to build strong career aspiration. And I do have some quotations, but we can kind of come back during Q&A. But the way perceived upward mobility helped building strong career aspirations was through the sense of responsibility and obligations that you have towards your parents. And you kind of want to continue being the proud daughter, right? But that really depends on how much you achieve, which is also related to upward mobility. And just the pure sense of achievement and accomplishment really helped to link upward mobility and perception of upward mobility to build very strong career aspirations. And there are some quotations right here. And because I have many interviews, I do have a lot of quotations, but I also have these like tables that shows how if the perception of upward mobility was there, and it was ranging from mid to high, women in my sample were much more likely to prioritize career aspirations over family aspirations. But when you felt like you have experienced downward mobility, your education or occupational achievement is not as high compared to your mother or compared to your peers, you kind of feel like you've just had same status as the beginning, you tend to gear towards prioritizing family aspirations or family desires. Last finding is actually related to how these aspirations relate to family aspirations or family planning, getting married, having children. Passengers of status construct career aspirations that are dependent on the needs of other family members and prioritize family needs and family desires, and including your own desires of having kids or getting married. Whereas drivers of status really aspires to prioritize career achievements over aspirations, including family formation and fertility. So going back to the same example, Mina and Sarang. So Mina will have one baby. She was the driver, like really status-seeking person who perceived that she had lots of upward mobility compared to her mother. She was saying, she wants one baby, but I'm not sure if this is possible because it really depends on her workplace and her situation in terms of security with her job. Similarly, a lot of women in this group with strong career aspirations, many of them wanted just one child. And actually, the rest of them anticipated non-marriage. So they were ready to kind of, adjust their marital desires and fertility desires because of their career aspirations. And that was really more of a primary rationale to construct their work and family decisions. Whereas Sarang and a lot of passenger side narrative forming group wanted to have two children. 40% wanted to have one child. The rest of them wanted to have two children as their aspirations. So mostly on average, they had much higher aspirations for having two children, getting married, and really prioritizing their family. So in the end, this is kind of like wrapping up my findings, the 3 findings. Your achieved as well as perceived upward mobility based on your education and employment and occupation really shaped how you aspired as a person, in particular related to prioritizing career and family aspirations. Again, yes, women in South Korea are put in this context situation where they kind of have to pick one over the other in terms of prioritizing because of the contextual structural aspect. I did not have a lot of chance to talk about those, but that is kind of given in terms of context. But within that context, still we see divergence of aspirations amongst women. And what distinguished these two different aspirations, one prioritizing family, the other prioritizing career, being very ambitious, was their perception of upward mobility and their aspirations for more mobility. Okay? At the end, if you prioritize family aspirations, you are likely to realize that because you're really adjusting a lot with career and the situations to achieve your family-related goals, like getting married or having children. So at the end, you're kind of reproducing gender norms that women stay at home and they, regardless of how much you gain at the education and occupational sphere, you're really reproducing existing gendered expectations and family norms where people get married and have 2 children or 1 to 2 children. Whereas drivers of status seeking prioritize family career aspirations within the context of South Korea, this requires you to sacrifice a lot of desires related to family and fertility, not getting married. So some of them actually expect not getting married or not having children, maybe not any, at max 1. And eventually, however, this kind of aspirations and trajectory for actual decision-making processes produce new gender and family norms. So there are aspirations that are polarized, but they are also impacting at the societal level in terms of gender and family norms. And I'm going to end with this the second implications of the findings, which is using the case of this South Korea, I argue that vanguards of egalitarian norms related to gender, as well as family norms, are those who experience relatively more upward mobility. And this relates to declining in marriage and fertility, and the nature of incompatibility between the two, in this case, family and career. My findings imply that changing demographic patterns are motivated by those who are shifting ideas about female achievement and gender norms in the context of Korea, and mostly coming from those who perceive that they experience upward mobility and aspire to continuously achieve upward mobility. Okay, that's it. I think I ran like 5 more minutes.
Thank you very much, Eunsil. I think we can take some questions now. Any takers? Pook, you want to pose your question?
Sorry. Hi, Eunsil. Hi, sorry. So I have a quick question. So since you talk about, respondents sort of trying to negotiate that aspiration, they reference themselves to the mothers. And since a number of them, of respondents in your sample, are married, right? So what kind of, did they talk about, or did you probe how they negotiate their aspiration with their husband, and how that might have implications for, their own aspiration? But by the way, thank you so much. I really enjoy your talk.
Thank you. Well, were you asking about the unmarried, not married interviewees?
No, the married interviewees and how they negotiate with their husbands when it comes to their own aspiration for work and, and family and building family.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the question. Yeah, so some of them had to go through negotiations, but I think some of them actually were considering their career aspirations when they were choosing or looking for partners. So they already had these ideas, and these aspirations were not very vague, especially the ones that they constructed after getting a job, then getting first job. And the average age for first marriage in Korea is like 29 to 30, which is pretty high. So until that moment, they thought a lot, and these aspirations are actually kind of they make decisions about dating and who to get married. All that's based on their aspirations as well. So I think that's why not many were fighting with their husbands over their own aspirations. They already kind of had these partners who kind of simultaneously had this joint idea that I'm gonna have my job, I'm not gonna quit. If you expect that from me, we can't get along already before getting married. So I think half of them kind of had that. So they didn't really say that they have really conflict, especially when they want to continuously work. But very few did have some conflict with their husbands, because their husbands, after having especially kids, they felt like, I think we have to adjust our plans. In that case, it was important. And this is kind of coming from my other work. In that case, women still worked, but depending on their mother's childcare labor. So they were asking their own mothers to help them out with childcare. And that kind of worked because remember, these women are those who had upper mobility from their mothers compared to their mothers. So their mothers were willing to help her out because they wanted to see their daughters to stay in the workforce. So that's kind of related. Like, you fight with your husband, but you still work. But there's childcare issue for mothers. But then you ask your own mother. So grandmother will come in, but not the paternal side, like not your in-law, but your own mother, because you have that linkage. Like, you're the proud daughter. So and this of course relates to low fertility rate that already kind of started. There are only like 2 or 3 siblings, or 2 siblings, or 1 sibling. So your mother won't be too busy, and she gets to pick the best, I guess, achieved upper mobility one, which is likely to be you, who want to keep working. So yeah, that's also another solution. So a lot of them ended up really keeping their job, regardless of like what their husband was trying to argue against.
Thank you. That's very interesting.
Thank you. Other questions from anyone else? If not, maybe I can ask a question, Eunsil. I was very taken by what you said about, women having to choose one over the other, right? So they can't have both. And for the most part, we see women having to make a trade-off between family and work. And I suppose the question is, why is that the case? And and what you said about ideological formation and having to understand how these ideologies are sustained. Actually, the first person I thought of is actually, as you mentioned just now, Michel Lemon. That people are always building, constructing boundaries. For example, Lemon talks about on the basis of morality, right? So one way by which I imagine an ideological formation could form would be people who would say things like, a good mother is one, who stays at home. And the implication being that if a mother aspires for career, she is therefore not a good mother. So this sort of Michel Lemon kind of ideological construction based on boundaries, especially by invoking the notions of morality. Who is a good mother and who is not? And these things are sort of tied to the way she prioritizes family over work or work over family and so on. So might that be a useful way to think about it in terms of the construction of moral boundaries? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think one issue that I was thinking about this ideal morality of good mother related to my work is that you are a good mother if you stay home or if you're really successful. So there is that emergence of new kind of good mother where you're so successful, so you're the proud mother, so you can work, you are eligible, you're entitled to work. But entitlement comes from the achievement, the amount of achievement that you have is, I think, my point. Like, you can be a good mother by staying home, but you can also be a good mother. So that's the possible option, but only option that's available if you achieve the upward mobility, or if you really achieve high enough. There's almost like I first call this project as a threshold perspective in understanding career aspirations, because I wanted to kind of emphasize that the bar is so high for women, but if you achieve above that bar, you can actually gain that respect and recognition of being a good mother, a good person, good daughter, good everything, good woman. But if you can't achieve above that high bar, like go to this Ivy League or you have amazing occupation, or have an economic ladder, upward mobility, unless the case, you really have to stay home to be a good mother. So there is not just one. Before, I agree that there's before it was almost like monolithic ideological expectations that you have to stay home, and there's a lot of negative implications about maternal employment and the impact on children. But now you do have that moral, cultural toolkit that supports you to be a good mother, even you're working, but only those who are high achieving or upward mobility seeking status, those folks get that chance to use that cultural morality is I think what I'm trying to argue. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense. The bargaining theory is always applied to men, because they are working, therefore they don't do the house chores and so on. But that sort of could be applied to women also, would you say, in some ways? But the catch, I suppose, is this, that the women would have to be very successful in order to justify, that sort of allocation. Yeah. And that actually, in some ways, underscores all the more the gender inequality between men and women. The fact that women would have to be very successful in order to say that, to qualify for that label of good mother, Yeah. Thank you. Okay, we have two hands raised here. So Dahe, would you like to pose your question? And then after that, I'll get Liu Yan to pose her question as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for interesting presentation. I'm also working on South Korea. Some of the papers are on South Korea, and I wanted to just ask one question. In one of the paper that I worked on, what I found was amongst highly educated couples, women tend to quit their job more often after childbirth and marriage when their partners are also highly educated. Sometimes they even quit their jobs even before the childbirth, So at the time I interpreted that the results that women don't need to work so hard, juggling, work and childcare if their husbands earn a lot, unlike, less educated couple. So even if quitting a job is going to waste their education, they are still fine. They still decide to quit their jobs. So I just wonder how to interpret this, outcome in terms of career aspiration perspective. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. So I think the interesting aspect of studying Korea, and I think this applies to Japan and Taiwan and some other countries where now majority of the women are highly educated. So by calling highly educated women, we're not actually catching the important essence of social change or maybe emergence of social change that can help us understand career aspirations, decisions, low fertility. So now we really have to cut these different educational attainment group, looking at educational credentials, prestigiousness of a university ranking, all these kind of symbolic indicators that are also not just symbolic, they relate to what kind of jobs you get. So if you look at my I do have exercise, but so in my exercise, there are different jobs that there are different lists of jobs for elite educated women versus BA holders from not top 10 universities from Korea. Their experiences are so different. Even though they're in the same highly educated group, there's so much growing big heterogeneity based on which university you went to, and then which job you received. Are you a lawyer, and then lawyer of what firm? Are you a consultant, but the first year McKinsey consultant, or versus like somewhere a consultant that you'd never heard of, the company wise. So these kind of symbolic boundaries have been becoming a very important source for class and upward mobility and all these distinctions in this highly educated setting. So without looking at how there are different, how these heterogeneous emerge within highly educated group, we wouldn't get overall kind of really important processes that distinguishes these aspirations. So I would definitely argue, yes, relatively to less educated women, there's different experiences and aspirations for highly educated women, but even amongst highly educated women, perception of upward mobility is very important in distinguishing their aspirations. And even for the less educated women group, depending on how much you perceive your success or achievement, how you define your success, that's going to determine your aspirations. So it's not just about your achieved status, but also your achieved status in terms of prestigiousness of a university, or the symbolic meaning of which job you had, which firm that you got your job to, but also this upward mobility aspect, which kind of relates to your transgenerational, like your parents' generation, like the lineage, the link between mother and daughter is also important. So yeah, definitely I agree that highly educated group is experiencing certain things, but there's heterogeneity within them as well because of the nature of Korea being just really uberly highly educated overall.
Thank you. Liu Yan.
Thank you, Prof. Oh. Thanks for sharing and feeding us with this very fruitful research. Basically, I have one curiosity and another clarification. So for the curiosity, so your polarized findings are actually very interesting. So one group of females prioritize their family aspiration versus another group of females are as drivers of their status aspiration. Then from my own curiosity, is there any neutral cases in your data set? I mean, those who can balance well their energy in both their family and career, or it's just a zero-sum game for females and they have to choose one side to focus on. And this is my curiosity. And the clarification is, I remember that in one of your slides about the summary of the main findings of your research, you wrote here, the reproducers of gendered expectations define female achievement as a resource to be invested in childbearing and managing the household. So here, I want to hear, could you please elaborate more on the reproducers? So reproducers referring to what, are there institutional barriers or it is ideological constraints? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I will answer the second question first. So the reproducers of ideologies is what I meant. They're not necessarily reproducers of institutionalized or kind of structural level or workplace organizational level constraints or opportunities even. They are the reproducers of ideologies, mainly kind of traditional, relatively more traditional norms about family, like how you have to get married or by age what, and you probably have to have a child in order to have a fulfillment in your life, in order to become an adult, you have to get married and have children, all these family norms. And it's better for woman and mother to take care of the children compared to men. all these kind of ideologies, and the reproducers of these ideologies will be reproducing these kind of existing norms, whereas vanguards of social change will be kind of rejecting to this idea that it's the only mother's role. Mother have to take care of the children. It's both parents have to be there. You know, both parents have desires and aspirations for career. They're the vanguards of new norms or new kind of social change ideologically. So I only meant in the ideological form, but looking at the roots from individual level aspirations. Am I frozen? Am I not? Okay. So answering your first question about neutral, I did have some, so I ended up calling them like it's polarization, but they're like stronger career aspirations versus weaker. Of course, they don't perfectly align into two different categories. There are some neutral ones where there are reserved ones where like, oh, I don't know, for now I'm like this, but I don't know if it might depend on what my boss does in the future, or if I have to find a new job, I might, you know, shift to becoming a family-oriented person. So there are some people who talks about these aspirations as a contingent on their future context or conditions. But even so, even though they have kind of neutral, or they say they have kind of neutral positions, even though in those cases, I would still kind of sense in my analysis that what is contingent on what is different. So for instance, if I say, well, if I don't get tenure in UW-Madison, I'll probably be staying home as a mom, or I'll find a person to get married, right? But the whole idea of contingency is actually, the focus is career, right? If I get tenure, if I don't get tenure, right? But if I'm gonna get tenure and I wanna get tenure, so I'm not gonna get married, or I'm not gonna become mom. So you kind of have that even within like neutral, seemingly neutral narrative, they do give you a lot of hints about what is relatively what is relatively prioritized and what is more contingent in their future predictions and aspirations.
Thank you very much. In the interest of time, because it's already 11:15 here, I will ask. So there are 3 hands raised here. So I will ask the respective participants to pose their question. 1 question each, yeah? 1 question. I'll just take all questions, and then you can note the questions, and then you can just answer. And then once you finish, we can call it a day. Yeah. Can I invite Adam to pose your question, followed by Atul and then Zachary? Adam, you want to start us off first?
Hello. Thank you very much. So should I ask the question here or?
Yeah, you can ask the question.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Actually, it's a follow-up questions on of your following previous comments. Thank you for the talk. Anyway, I learned a lot, and it's about the prioritization of career and family. So one thing is that when I hear your answer to the previous question is that it's relative. So maybe some people say that they're neutral, but actually they still put relative importance to certain aspect, right? I recently I'm also working on related issues, but in the context of Hong Kong. So when I conduct the interview, sometimes actually when the women said some respondents said that they focus on career or family, but actually it is not purely career prioritizing. So sometimes some women say that they really focus on career because they're highly educated, they don't want to waste the talent. But it really depends on the situation, because for example, if their kids are sick, and no matter how important the work related tasks are, they will take care of the children first. So although in everyday life, it seems that they prioritizing career, but in the critical moment, family first. So although you say relative, so in the normal day it's a relatively career prioritizing, but I think it also depends on how critical the event. And to these women that I interview, I feel that even they say they are career oriented, but when the critical moments come, if they really have to choose, going for work, for some very important work, and when the children are sick, they will take care of the children. So I wonder how in your data did the same things appear in your data, and how would you theorize, okay, on the so-called the importance, relative importance, and prioritizations. So are you talking about on average normal days, or even the critical moment, what to choose? Thank you.
Thank you. Atul, can you pose your question?
Professor, so my question is really, I would like to see if you have more insights on your respondents who were single. So like you mentioned, right, there's this trend in Korea where like women are leaving the patriarchy. So I would think that if you're single and you choose not to get married and focus on your career, you would be seen as belonging to that part, right? Like resisting the patriarchy, or there will be some form of resistance. But in doing so, do you feel that it also kind of puts them at a disadvantage? So for example, in Singapore, or basically in cultures that are pro-family, we know that citizens with like families, they are the ones who end up with more benefits. There are more like state benefits. For example, in Singapore, there are like housing policy benefits. So in the long run, do you see that even though there is a form of resistance, there is a form of new gender norms, or new cultural norms, do women still end up being disadvantaged? Do they still kind of get that short end of the stick, regardless of whether they are single, focusing on career, or whether like they're married and with a family?
Thank you, Atul. Zachary?
Hi, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, maybe in the interest of time, because I see that we're already over time, I'll just thank Eunsil for your talk so much, and I could write an email with my questions. But it's a fantastic talk, and I'm really grateful for you for sharing.
Oh, thank you, Zachary. Okay, you want to answer Adam's question first, followed by Atul and Eunsil?
Yeah, so yeah, Zachary, feel free to email me your question. So in terms of external shock, I think, Adam, I love your work, all the work, by the way. I think, referring to a lot of other work that you did too, like the change in marital status and parental status will probably change their rhetoric too, but maybe not dramatically, because of the stickiness of your aspirations, and some of the aspirations are really close to your anticipation, what you're actually going to do short term. So of course, there's a temporality variation on how much the aspirations is going to predict what you're going to do. But my overall argument is related to average kind of normal day, assuming that's the case. So I only had like 1 or 2 cases where they had children with some disorder. So they ended up shifting to part-time job amongst the women. But I think especially the external shock or these kind of events, definitely there will be reproduction of gender division of labor, unpaid paid labor. Women are going to do more. I see a very interesting pattern in the context of South Korea, where if you, even within external kind of conditions or shocks, there are kind of division of labor, childcare labor amongst women intergenerationally. So if my child is sick, I might call my husband, but if that's not the case, I will call my mom. Sometimes rather than me, I would go if it's a really serious conditions, but I wouldn't quit my job because of that. In the long term, you will reach out for help, but the help wouldn't necessarily come. The solution is not necessarily you quitting the job. It's not always the case, but I can't really say a lot about what happens when there's like external shock, where a child is sick, where there's an emergency, where your child starts preparing for SAT. That's a very different age group. So for the older age group, I don't think my findings might apply, because that's different, different preparation for college. And so usually the average one. But interesting point though is that even it can actually be vice versa, where your family needs more money. Let's say your children needs more money. You might have family-oriented aspirations, but you might go out for work. So I think the other way can also help actually work, because you want to focus on family, but still the aspiration is for the family, but you need to work because you need more money as a family to support your your children's education, right? Extracurricular. In that case, you can actually start working. So yeah, I can't really generalize this. Of course, that's not my aim, but it's really hard to talk about what happens when there is an external shock or very important event that happens to your household and to children's well-being. But I look forward to your work though. It'd be really nice. In terms of singles, the question about the singlehood and then and policy support. If I understand the question right, it's more about how, correct me if I'm wrong, how the societal support or government support, like housing for only married couples, might shape this singles decision making or aspirations for family and work, is my understanding of your question. So it's a very interesting one, but I think I will definitely need a comparative case to explore that question and to investigate how the social support or welfare system enables women to reject to marriage, or it might actually prohibit them to change these family norms. Because let's say you get only the housing discount only when you get married to have this heterosexual marriage relationship. In that case, you want to reject to marriage, but you might not be able to as much as in the context in which you don't necessarily get a housing because you're married to a person. So, but I do definitely need a comparison group in terms of societal level support to investigate that question though. But that's a very interesting one. Although in South Korea, there is some support for married couples, but there's also emergence of chosen family where you live with other people that are not biologically your family. There is not huge percentage, high percentage, but there is emergence of new family formation, kind of new type of family where they're roommates, but you're living in this household to save money. You're rejecting to marriage, having children, but you're trying to do that. But as I said, I think I will probably need a comparison group to answer your question. But thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Eunsil, thank you for taking the evening and spending time with us and sharing your research, which is really very interesting. I really appreciate. Shall we show our appreciation to Eunsil? Thank you, everyone. Have a good day and good evening. Thank you.
Thank you. So just log off or?
Yes.